Sing for me and I'll marry you." Victoria Sterling's champagne sloshed as she pointed at Anthony Davis. The billionaire heiress had just watched the black waiter gracefully serve her table, and alcohol mixed with arrogance sparked a cruel idea. "What?" Anthony stopped mid-step, silver tray balanced in his hands. "You heard me." Victoria's voice carried across Manhattan's Plaza Hotel ballroom. "Sing something pretty and I'll make you the luckiest man alive. I'll marry you." Cruel laughter erupted from her circle of elite friends. Phones appeared instantly, sensing viral content. Anthony stood frozen as 200 guests turned to stare. "Unless—" Victoria's smile turned vicious. "You're too scared? Can't actually sing?" Anthony felt every camera lens, every assumption, every ounce of privilege crushing down on him. Have you ever watched someone's cruelty become their own destruction? What Anthony did next broke the internet. 8 months earlier, Anthony Davis had stood on the stage at Lincoln Center, his cap and gown pristine as he accepted his master's degree in vocal performance from Juilliard. Summa cum laude, the youngest in his class to receive the prestigious Whitman Fellowship. His future stretched before him like an open highway to Broadway. Then his father collapsed. The stroke came without warning, stealing Robert Davis's speech and mobility in one cruel instant. The medical bills arrived like vultures, $180,000 for emergency surgery, rehabilitation, specialized care. Anthony's family savings evaporated overnight. His mother worked double shifts at the hospital, but it wasn't enough. The man who had sacrificed everything to send his son to the world's most prestigious music school now needed saving himself. So Anthony traded his practice rooms for serving trays, his arias for "yes, sir," and "right away, ma'am." Every morning at 5 a.m., before the city woke, he descended into the subway tunnels of Grand Central. The acoustics were perfect there, his voice bouncing off tile walls as commuters hurried past, most too busy to notice the trained tenor warming up for another day of invisibility. Sterling entertainment events paid the best. Victoria Sterling's empire dominated Broadway, film, and television, and her charity galas attracted the wealthiest donors in New York. The irony wasn't lost on Anthony serving champagne to the same people who could finance his Broadway debut with pocket change. He'd watched Victoria operate for months. She possessed the casual cruelty that came with inherited wealth, treating artists like pets to be fed or discarded at will. Her charity theater was legendary, funding arts programs while ensuring the artists remained appropriately grateful and subservient. "We help these people," he'd overheard her telling donors just last week, "but let's be realistic about their limitations." The other servers shared their stories in whispered conversations during smoke breaks. James had been called boy for 6 straight months. Maria endured comments about cleaning lady work despite having a master's degree in hospitality. But they all needed the money, so they swallowed the daily humiliations and cashed their checks. Anthony's co-workers knew him as the guy who hummed while working, whose voice drifted through the kitchen during prep work. They called him Songbird affectionately, not knowing that his warm-ups were more sophisticated than most Broadway performers' full repertoires. Tonight's gala was different. Anthony had noticed familiar faces in the crowd, classmates from Juilliard now working as assistants to casting directors, music directors who remembered his senior recital. They sat at donor tables, sipping wine he served, their eyes carefully avoiding his. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. 3 years ago, these same people had given him standing ovations. Now they pretended not to see him, protecting their own precarious positions in an industry where perception was everything. Victoria Sterling embodied everything wrong with the system. She controlled access to stages, to opportunities, to dreams themselves. Her wealth bought her the right to determine who belonged in her world and who existed to serve it. She'd built her empire on the talents of others while ensuring they remained dependent on her approval. As Anthony moved through the ballroom that evening, he carried 8 months of accumulated rage. Every dismissive glance, every casual slight, every moment his humanity had been reduced to his uniform. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes you have to be twice as good to get half the recognition. He'd been twice as good his entire life. Valedictorian in high school, full scholarship to Juilliard, academic honors, performance awards, the respect of professors who'd trained Metropolitan Opera stars. But in Victoria Sterling's world, none of that mattered. He was just another black face in service clothes. The final insult came during dinner service. Anthony overheard Victoria explaining her diversity initiatives to potential investors, describing how she discovered talent in urban communities and gave them opportunities they couldn't find elsewhere. She spoke about black and brown artists like rescue animals, grateful for scraps from her table. The key, she explained to tech mogul James Carter, is managing expectations. These people have natural ability, but they lack the refinement for major productions. We give them small roles, community theater. It's perfect for everyone. Anthony's hands shook as he refilled water glasses. Every word was a dagger, each assumption a denial of his humanity. Victoria Sterling had never heard him sing, never seen his transcripts, never bothered to learn his name. To her, he was a category, not a person. The humiliation was systematic, designed to keep people like him in their place. But Victoria had made one crucial miscalculation. She assumed Anthony's silence meant acceptance. She mistook his professionalism for submission. She had no idea that her charity case possessed a voice that could shatter crystal and a will that had been forged by years of proving himself in rooms where he wasn't wanted. Tonight, that miscalculation would cost her everything. The challenge wasn't spontaneous. Victoria Sterling had been building to this moment all evening, each glass of champagne amplifying her need to assert dominance. Something about Anthony's graceful movements irritated her like a splinter under manicured skin. "You heard me correctly," Victoria repeated, her voice carrying across the marble ballroom. "Sing something pretty, and I'll marry you." The crowd formed a loose circle, phones held high like digital torches. What Victoria didn't know was that Broadway casting director Sarah Martinez sat incognito at table 12, suddenly very interested in the unfolding drama. "Unless you can't actually sing." Victoria's voice dripped with false concern. "All that bragging about natural talent?" Anthony set his serving tray down with deliberate precision. The crystal glasses clinked softly, the only sound in the silent ballroom. His mind raced through possibilities: walk away and keep his job, or accept this public humiliation disguised as opportunity. "I accept your challenge," Anthony said quietly. "But when I'm done, we discuss this marriage proposal seriously." Victoria's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "What are you going to sing?" "Something from the streets?" "Actually," Anthony removed his server's jacket, folding it over a chair, "I was thinking Puccini. Nessun Dorma. Are you familiar with opera, Ms. Sterling?" The question hung like a challenge returned. Victoria's smile faltered, a micro-expression caught by dozens of phones. "Opera? How pretentious. But go ahead, impress us." Anthony walked to the center of the space. The ballroom's acoustics were excellent high ceilings and marble surfaces that would carry sound beautifully. "This aria," Anthony addressed the crowd, "is about a prince proving himself through impossible challenges." Seemed appropriate. Sarah Martinez leaned forward at table 12. Something in Anthony's bearing suggested this wouldn't be karaoke. Anthony closed his eyes, finding his center. In his mind, he was back in the subway tunnels at dawn, where his voice could soar without judgment. He thought of his father, his mother's double shifts. Every moment his worth had been reduced to his uniform. When he opened his eyes, the nervous waiter was gone. The first note shattered every assumption in the room. Anthony's hands trembled slightly as he rolled up his sleeves, the simple gesture transforming him from servant to performer. The ballroom had fallen into a cathedral silence, 200 of New York's elite holding their collective breath. He approached the grand piano where the evening's accompanist sat frozen, sheet music scattered across the bench. "Do you know Puccini?" Anthony asked quietly. The pianist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, nodded slowly. "Key of G?" "Perfect." Anthony's voice carried a confidence that hadn't been there moments before. "Follow my tempo." Victoria Sterling watched from her position near the bar, champagne glass dangling from her fingers. The smug satisfaction on her face was already shifting to uncertainty. This wasn't how these things usually went. Her victims typically stammered excuses or fled in embarrassment. "Having second thoughts?" she called out, her voice slightly too loud, betraying her own nervousness. "It's not too late to go back to serving drinks." Anthony turned to face her directly. For the first time all evening, he looked her in the eye as an equal, not as someone seeking permission to exist in her space. "Ms. Sterling," he said, his voice carrying across the marble expanse, "I've spent 8 months watching you treat people like entertainment. Tonight you get to see what real talent looks like." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the usual dynamic they'd come to expect at Sterling events. Sarah Martinez pulled out her phone, but not to record mockery. Something in Anthony's posture, the way he commanded space without arrogance, reminded her of the great performers she'd worked with. Her finger hovered over the record button, sensing she was about to witness something remarkable. Victoria's laugh came out forced, hollow. Bold words for someone whose biggest stage is a catering kitchen. "Actually," Anthony smiled, the expression transforming his entire face, "my biggest stage was Lincoln Center. But tonight, this will do." The pianist played the opening notes, delicate and haunting. Anthony closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. In his mind, he wasn't in a ballroom full of judgmental strangers. He was back in his voice teacher's studio, preparing for his senior recital. He was in his childhood church, where his grandmother first discovered his gift. He was in every moment his voice had been his salvation. When he opened his mouth, the first note that emerged wasn't just sound. It was 8 months of suppressed dignity, years of proving himself, generations of dreams deferred but never abandoned. Victoria Sterling was about to learn the difference between talent and training, between natural ability and disciplined excellence. She was about to discover that sometimes the person you underestimate most is the one who will humble you completely. "Nessun dorma, nessun dorma." The opening phrase exploded from Anthony's chest like a force of nature, filling every corner of the Plaza Hotel ballroom with crystalline power. The Italian words rolled off his tongue with perfect pronunciation, each syllable carved from years of classical training. Victoria Sterling's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. The sound went unnoticed. Every person in the room was transfixed by the voice soaring above them. Anthony's technique was flawless. His breath control, honed through countless hours of practice, allowed him to sustain notes that seemed humanly impossible. The high B-flat that marked the aria's climax approached like thunder in the distance, building with mathematical precision. Sarah Martinez grabbed her assistant's arm, her eyes wide with recognition. "Do you know what we're hearing?" she whispered urgently. "That's Juilliard-level training. That's conservatory technique." The crowd's phones, initially raised to capture mockery, now recorded in stunned silence. Comments on the live streams shifted in real-time laughing emojis, replaced by fire symbols, shocked faces, crown icons. "This can't be real," someone whispered. "Is he lip-syncing?" "No way a waiter sounds like that." But Anthony was just getting started. As the aria built toward its famous climax, he began to improvise, weaving in gospel inflections that spoke to his church upbringing, adding runs and embellishments that showcased both his classical training and his cultural roots. Victoria stood frozen, watching her carefully constructed narrative crumble. This wasn't supposed to happen. Waiters didn't sing like Metropolitan Opera principals. Service staff didn't command rooms with the authority of trained performers. The pianist, recognizing genius when she heard it, began to follow Anthony's lead, her accompaniment growing more confident with each phrase. She'd played for Pavarotti tributes and Carnegie Hall galas. This young man belonged on those stages. All'alba vincerò, vincerò, vincerò. The final high note rang out like a battle cry, sustained for what felt like an eternity. Anthony's voice filled every crevice of the ballroom, bouncing off crystal chandeliers and marble columns, creating harmonics that made the very air shimmer. When silence finally returned, it lasted for 3 heartbeats. Then the room exploded. A standing ovation erupted from every corner. Guests who moments before had been preparing to watch a humiliation instead found themselves witnessing something transcendent. Phones continued recording as people wiped away tears they didn't expect to shed. "Holy shit," tech mogul James Carter muttered, his usual composure shattered. "Who is this guy?" "This." Broadway veteran Michael Torres, who'd been quietly eating at table 8, stood and began a slow clap. "Bravo!" he shouted. "Bravissimo!" The applause continued for over a minute, washing over Anthony like absolution. He stood center stage, no longer a waiter, no longer invisible. For the first time in 8 months, he was simply what he'd always been, an artist. Victoria Sterling remained motionless, her face cycling through shock, embarrassment, and something approaching panic. Around her, donors and industry professionals buzzed with excitement. Where has he been hiding? Why is he serving drinks? Someone get him an agent. Sarah Martinez was already moving, pushing through the crowd toward Anthony. She'd discovered stars before plucked unknowns from obscurity and placed them on Broadway stages. But she'd never found one serving canapes at a charity gala. "Excuse me?" she called out, her voice cutting through the continuing applause. "I'm Sarah Martinez, casting director for the upcoming Phantom revival." "We need to talk." Anthony turned toward her voice, still catching his breath from the performance. The crowd began to part, creating a path between them like recognition of royalty. Victoria found her voice at last. "Now wait just a minute," she called out, her words slurring slightly. This was just entertainment, a little fun for the evening, but the crowd's energy had shifted completely. They weren't looking at Victoria anymore. Every eye was on Anthony, every phone still recording, every conversation about the mysterious waiter who'd just redefined their understanding of talent. James Carter approached Victoria with barely concealed disgust. "You had this man serving drinks? Are you insane? Do you realize what we just witnessed?" He's just..." Victoria stammered, her usual confidence evaporating. "He's a catering staff." "That man," Sarah Martinez announced to the surrounding crowd, "just delivered one of the finest renditions of Nessun Dorma I've heard outside the Met. If he's a catering staff, then I'm the Queen of England." Laughter rippled through the crowd, not at Anthony this time, but at the absurdity of the situation. The room's social dynamics had inverted completely. Victoria, for the first time in her privileged life, found herself on the outside looking in. Anthony stood in the center of it all, still processing what had just happened. 8 months of humiliation had been erased in 4 minutes of truth. His voice, the gift his grandmother had recognized in a church pew 20 years ago, the talent Juilliard had refined and honored, had finally been heard. But as the applause began to die down and reality reasserted itself, Anthony knew this was far from over. Victoria Sterling controlled too much, had too much power, commanded too many stages. One performance, no matter how transcendent, wouldn't be enough to change a system built on keeping people like him in their assigned places. The real battle was just beginning. Victoria Sterling's recovery was swift and vicious. As the applause finally died down, she stepped forward, her smile sharp as a blade, champagne-induced confidence returning with predatory focus. "Well, well," she announced, her voice cutting through the murmur of impressed conversations. "That was lovely. Truly. But anyone can memorize one aria, can't they?" The room's energy shifted, sensing danger. Sarah Martinez paused mid-stride toward Anthony, her expression darkening. "I mean," Victoria continued, her voice growing louder, more theatrical, "we've all been to karaoke bars. One good song doesn't make someone Broadway material." She laughed, the sound hollow and desperate. "Real artists prove themselves under pressure. Real performers adapt." James Carter frowned. "Victoria, what are you doing?" But Victoria was already committed to her course of destruction. She'd built her empire on controlling narratives, on determining who belonged on her stages. One waiter with a good voice wouldn't topple decades of careful hierarchy. "I have a proposal," she announced, pulling out her phone with theatrical flourish. "Since our friend here seems to think he's ready for the big leagues, let's give him a real audition." Anthony's stomach dropped. He recognized the trap being set and could see Victoria's fingers flying across her phone screen, undoubtedly texting instructions to someone. "Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. at the Sterling Theater," Victoria declared. "Open audition for the lead role in my upcoming Broadway production. If he's as good as he claims, he should have no trouble securing the part." The crowd murmured approval, not realizing the setup. To them, it sounded like an opportunity. To Anthony, it felt like execution. Victoria's smile turned predatory. "Unless, of course, you're having second thoughts?" One song in a ballroom is very different from a real audition on a real stage. Sarah Martinez stepped forward. "Victoria, this is highly irregular. Auditions require preparation time, proper—" "Oh, come now," Victoria waved dismissively. "If he's truly talented, he won't need preparation. Natural ability should shine through, shouldn't it?" Behind her theatrical performance, Victoria's mind was racing. 6 a.m. meant no preparation time. Her director, Marcus Webb, was already in her pocket. One text would ensure the audition became an impossible gauntlet. She could choose the most difficult pieces, create conditions no one could meet, then point to the failure as proof that she'd been right all along. "What's the piece?" Anthony asked quietly, though he already knew the answer would be a trap. Victoria's grin widened. "Oh, I think Music of the Night from Phantom. But let's make it interesting." She paused, savoring the moment. "You'll perform it with choreography in the original key, with full staging, just like a real audition." The room fell silent. Even those unfamiliar with musical theater understood the impossibility of what Victoria was proposing. Full staging meant blocking, movement, character work, all requiring rehearsal time Anthony wouldn't have. "Furthermore," Victoria continued, warming to her theme, "you'll audition in front of a panel of industry professionals. Real judges who understand what Broadway requires." What she didn't say was that she'd already chosen her panel friends who owed her favors, industry insiders who valued their relationships with Sterling Entertainment more than artistic integrity. Anthony felt the weight of every eye in the room. To refuse would confirm every assumption Victoria had made about him. To accept meant walking into an obvious trap with cameras rolling. "And if I fail this rigged audition?" Anthony asked, his voice carrying clearly. "Rigged?" Victoria's laugh was sharp with false innocence. "How could it be rigged?" "You'll have the same opportunity as any professional performer, unless you're suggesting that professional standards are somehow unfair." The verbal trap was elegant in its cruelty. Any complaint about the conditions would sound like excuses, like proof that Anthony didn't belong in professional theater. James Carter stepped forward, his expression troubled. "Victoria, this seems absolutely fair," Victoria interrupted. "Mr. Davis wanted to prove himself. I'm giving him that chance. On a real stage, with real standards, judged by real professionals." Anthony looked around the room, seeing the mixture of anticipation and concern on faces that moments before had been celebrating his talent. The social media live streams continued, documenting every moment of his public challenge. "There's one condition," Anthony said finally, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. Victoria's eyebrow arched. "You're hardly in a position to make demands." "If I pass your audition," Anthony continued, "you publicly acknowledge your mistake tonight. You admit that you judged me based on assumptions rather than ability." The room held its breath. Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the fury beneath her composed exterior. "And if you fail," she countered, "you're banned from all Sterling Entertainment properties. No more catering jobs, no more opportunities. Complete blacklist. The stakes couldn't be higher. Anthony's livelihood, his father's medical bills, his family's future, all balanced on the edge of Victoria's rigged game." But as Anthony looked around the room, he saw something Victoria had missed. Sarah Martinez was recording everything on her phone. James Carter was shaking his head in disgust. The crowd was beginning to understand the systematic cruelty they were witnessing. Victoria Sterling had just made her biggest mistake. In her desperation to maintain control, she'd exposed the ugly machinery of her power for everyone to see. "I accept," Anthony said quietly. The trap was set. But Victoria had no idea that her victim was about to become her downfall. Anthony barely slept. By 4 a.m., he gave up and headed to the subway tunnels, his voice echoing off familiar tiles as he practiced Music of the Night. The song was technically demanding, emotionally complex, a perfect trap requiring both vocal power and theatrical vulnerability. But Anthony had performed it before. His Juilliard senior recital had included the complete phantom role, earning the highest marks in his class. At 5:30 a.m., he emerged to find something impossible waiting outside Sterling Theater. Nearly 200 people bundled against the morning cold, holding coffee and phones. College students, Broadway fans, voice teachers with students' word had spread through the theater community overnight. "There he is," someone shouted. Anthony was suddenly surrounded by supporters he'd never met. "We saw the video! Show them what real talent looks like!" Sarah Martinez pushed through the crowd, her expression urgent. "Anthony, we need to talk." She pulled him aside, whispering, "I've been making calls all night." Victoria's rigged this completely. The panel is stacked with people who owe Sterling Entertainment everything. "However," she continued with a grim smile, "they don't know I'm here." Officially observing, unofficially documenting everything for a Broadway integrity investigation. At 5:55 a.m., Victoria's car arrived. She stepped out expecting an empty street and a broken young man ready to accept defeat quietly. Instead, she found witnesses, cameras, and live streamers documenting every moment. Her private execution had become a public trial. "What is this?" she demanded. "Justice," called a voice from the crowd. "We're here to see fair play." Victoria's face went pale. This wasn't supposed to happen. Auditions were controlled environments where she managed outcomes without oversight. James Carter emerged from the crowd, his expression cold. "Victoria, I hope you're prepared to honor your commitments. The world is watching." As theater doors opened, Anthony walked through no longer alone. He carried hopes of everyone who'd been underestimated, told they didn't belong. Victoria Sterling wanted to destroy him privately. Instead, she'd created the stage for her own reckoning. Inside the Sterling Theater, Victoria's panic transformed into calculated malice. She'd built her empire by crushing threats before they could grow, and Anthony Davis had become an existential danger to everything she'd constructed. "Change of plans," she whispered urgently to Marcus Webb, her director, as the crowd filed into the theater. "Make this impossible." Webb nodded, his loyalty bought and paid for through years of Victoria's patronage. "What do you want me to do?" "Everything. Wrong key, no warm-up, add dance requirements, and get those plants in the audience ready to ask the right questions." Victoria had prepared for this moment. Scattered throughout the crowd were her employees, casting assistants, junior agents, people whose careers depended on her approval. Their job was simple: create doubt about Anthony's legitimacy at crucial moments. As Anthony took the stage, Victoria announced the adjusted parameters of the audition. "We've decided to make this more authentic to real Broadway conditions. Mr. Davis will perform Music of the Night in the original key of E-flat minor no accompanist, just the backing track. Professional performers should be able to adapt." The key change was devastating. Most tenors performed the piece in D minor for vocal safety. E-flat minor pushed the high notes into a dangerous range that could shatter even trained voices. "Additionally," Victoria continued, her smile poisonous, "since this is for a lead role, we'll need to see movement and stage presence. Please incorporate the staging from the original production." Sarah Martinez stood up in the audience. "This is highly irregular. No audition includes choreography without rehearsal time." "Ms. Martinez," Victoria's voice turned icy, "this is a sterling entertainment audition. We set our own standards." But Victoria's cruelest stroke was still coming. As Anthony prepared to begin, one of her planted audience members raised his hand. "Excuse me," the man called out, "but shouldn't we know more about Mr. Davis's background? I mean, if he's really qualified for Broadway, where has he been performing?" Victoria seized the opening like a predator. "An excellent point. Mr. Davis, please tell us about your recent professional experience." The trap was elegant in its cruelty. Anthony couldn't mention Juilliard without exposing his overqualification for the catering job, making his current situation seem suspicious. But admitting to only service work would undermine his credibility as a performer. "I've been focusing on private study," Anthony said carefully. Another plant in the audience scoffed loudly. "Private study? That's code for unemployment, isn't it?" Nervous laughter rippled through parts of the crowd. Victoria smiled triumphantly. "Furthermore," she announced, "we've discovered some interesting information about Mr. Davis's financial situation. Apparently, he's been working service jobs to pay off significant debts. One has to wonder if this is all just a publicity stunt to advance his circumstances." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Victoria had weaponized Anthony's most vulnerable point, his father's medical bills, the financial desperation that had forced him into service work and turned it into evidence of dishonest motives. "That's disgusting," someone called from the audience, but Victoria pressed her advantage. "I'm not judging," she said with false sympathy, "but we need to consider whether this young man is genuinely talented or simply desperate for attention and financial opportunity." Anthony felt the shift in the room's energy. Doubt crept across faces that had been supportive moments before. The systematic assassination of his character was surgical in its precision. Marcus Webb stepped forward with the final blow. "Given these concerns about authenticity, I think we should also test Mr. Davis's versatility. After Music of the Night, perhaps he could perform something more suited to his background. Some hip-hop, maybe? Something urban?" The racism was so blatant, so casually delivered, that several audience members gasped audibly. But Victoria nodded approvingly. "Excellent suggestion. Real performers should be comfortable with various genres." Anthony stood center stage, feeling the weight of systematic oppression crushing down on him. Every assumption, every stereotype, every barrier he'd spent his life overcoming had been weaponized against him in a matter of minutes. The crowd's cameras continued recording, documenting not just an audition, but the ugly machinery of institutional racism operating in real time. Victoria Sterling thought she'd cornered her prey. She'd exposed his vulnerabilities, questioned his motives, and set impossible standards designed to ensure his failure. But she'd made one crucial error. In her desperation to destroy Anthony, she'd revealed her own character so completely that even her supporters began to recoil in disgust. James Carter stood up slowly, his face dark with anger. "Victoria, this is reprehensible. You're destroying your own reputation. I'm maintaining standards," Victoria snapped back, her mask finally slipping completely. Anthony looked out at the divided crowd, seeing the battle lines forming. Some faces showed disgust at Victoria's tactics. Others reflected the poisonous doubt she'd carefully planted. This was bigger than one audition now. This was about every person who'd been systematically excluded, every talent dismissed because it didn't fit predetermined categories, every dream deferred by institutional bias. Anthony closed his eyes and found his center one last time. When he opened them, he was ready for war. The theater fell into stunned silence after Victoria's racist demands. The mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the ugly machinery of systemic oppression operating in broad daylight. Sarah Martinez stood up slowly, her phone still recording. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed textbook discrimination. Ms. Sterling has created impossible conditions, questioned this man's motives based on his financial situation, and now demands he perform urban music because of his race." Her voice carried across the theater with prosecutorial precision. "I've been documenting every word. This will be submitted to the Broadway Equity Association and the New York Civil Rights Commission." James Carter rose from his seat, his face dark with disgust. "Victoria, I'm pulling Carter Technologies funding from all Sterling Entertainment projects effective immediately. This is reprehensible. Victoria's confident mask cracked." "James, you're overreacting. I'm simply maintaining professional standards." "Professional standards?" A new voice cut through the theater. Broadway veteran Michael Torres stood in the back, his presence commanding immediate attention. "I've been on Broadway for 30 years. What you're doing isn't professional, it's criminal." The crowd began to shift. Victoria's planted supporters found themselves isolated as genuine theater professionals spoke up. "I know Anthony Davis," called out Professor Elena Rodriguez from the audience. "He was my student at Juilliard, summa cum laude graduate, Whitman Fellowship recipient. This young man has more training than half the performers currently on Broadway." Gasps rippled through the theater. Victoria's face went white as her carefully constructed narrative collapsed. "You knew?" Sarah Martinez's voice was deadly quiet. "You knew he was Juilliard trained and you had him serving drinks?" Another voice joined the chorus. "I'm Dr. Patricia Williams, Director of Vocal Studies at Manhattan School of Music. Anthony auditioned for our master's program 3 years ago. We offered him a full scholarship, but he declined to attend Juilliard instead." The theater erupted in angry murmurs. Victoria's systematic humiliation was being exposed layer by layer, each revelation making her actions more monstrous. "Furthermore," Dr. Williams continued, "I've been following his story on social media since last night. This young man lost his family savings to his father's medical bills. He's been working service jobs to pay for his father's care while maintaining his vocal training. That's not desperation, that's heroism." Anthony stood center stage, watching his story reclaim itself from Victoria's poisonous narrative. The allies emerging from the crowd weren't just supporters, they were witnesses to his actual worth, people who knew his truth. Marcus Webb, Victoria's director, stepped forward nervously. "Perhaps we should reconsider the audition parameters." "No." Anthony's voice cut through the chaos, strong and clear. "I'll take the audition exactly as Ms. Sterling designed it." The theater fell silent again. "E-flat minor, no warm-up with staging," Anthony continued. "And yes, I'll follow it with something urban if that's what you require." Because I want everyone to see exactly who Victoria Sterling is. Victoria's trap had become her exposure. By demanding impossible conditions, she'd created a platform for Anthony to demonstrate not just his versatility, but the depth of her prejudice. Sarah Martinez smiled grimly. Anthony, before you begin, I want to make an announcement. Based on what I've witnessed today, I'm offering you the lead role in the Phantom of the Opera revival, regardless of how this audition proceeds. The crowd erupted in applause, but Anthony raised his hand for silence. Thank you, Miss Martinez, but I want to earn this fairly. I want to show everyone, especially Ms. Sterling, what happens when you judge talent based on assumptions rather than ability. He turned to face Victoria directly. You wanted to see what I could do under pressure. You wanted to test my versatility? Perfect. Let's give the people what they came for. Victoria found herself trapped by her own machinations. To back down now would be to admit her cruelty publicly. To continue meant watching Anthony potentially succeed under conditions designed for his failure, proving her incompetence as a talent evaluator. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. Begin whenever you're ready. Anthony walked to center stage, no longer the nervous waiter from the night before. The crowd's support had transformed him, reminding him of who he'd always been underneath the uniform and humiliation. Professor Rodriguez called out from the audience, "Remember your training, Anthony. Remember who you are." Dr. Williams added, "Show them what excellence looks like." Sarah Martinez held up her phone. "The world is watching." Anthony nodded to the sound booth. The opening notes of Music of the Night began to play in the punishing key of E-flat minor, just as Victoria had demanded. As the music swelled, Anthony closed his eyes and found his center. When he opened them, every trace of the service worker was gone. In his place stood a Juilliard-trained artist, backed by an army of allies who knew his worth. Victoria Sterling was about to learn the difference between breaking someone and forging them into something stronger. The opening notes of Music of the Night filled the Sterling Theater like a gathering storm. Anthony stood center stage, transformed from the nervous waiter of yesterday into something altogether more dangerous, an artist with nothing left to lose. Nighttime sharpens, heightens each sensation. His voice cut through the punishing key of E-flat minor like a blade through silk. The high notes that should have strained his vocal cords soared effortlessly, each phrase more powerful than the last. Years of subway tunnel practice had conditioned his voice for any acoustic challenge. Victoria Sterling gripped her seat arms, watching her carefully constructed trap become Anthony's triumph. The impossible key that should have broken him only showcased the true extent of his training. But Anthony wasn't finished. As the song reached its bridge, he began to move. Not the clumsy staging Victoria expected, but the elegant choreography he'd learned during his Juilliard Phantom production. Every gesture was precise, every step calculated to enhance the emotional arc of the piece. Turn your face away from the garish light of day. The audience sat mesmerized as Anthony embodied the Phantom's seductive darkness. His movements flowed like liquid shadow across the stage, creating a character so compelling that several casting directors were already reaching for their phones. Sarah Martinez leaned forward, her eyes bright with recognition. This wasn't just good, this was star-making material. Victoria tried one last desperate interruption. "That's enough," she called out. "We've heard sufficient. Let him finish!" The shout came from multiple voices in the audience. Even some of Victoria's planted supporters had been won over by the sheer artistry unfolding before them. Anthony's voice soared toward the climactic high notes, his breath control flawless despite the demanding choreography. The E-flat that should have been impossible rang out clear and powerful, sustained for what felt like an eternity. As the final notes faded, the theater erupted. Standing ovations thundered from every corner, phones capturing every moment of Victoria's humiliation. But Anthony wasn't done. "You wanted something urban? he said into the wireless microphone, his voice carrying clearly over the applause. "Let me show you what versatility really means." Without accompaniment, he began to sing, "His Eye is on the Sparrow," the gospel standard his grandmother had taught him in church 25 years ago. His voice transformed again, trading operatic precision for soulful authenticity, proving that his talent transcended genre boundaries. The fusion was breathtaking. Classical technique merged with gospel soul, creating something entirely new. Anthony's voice told the story of struggle and faith, of talent persevering despite systematic oppression. Victoria Sterling watched her worldview crumble. This man, this waiter, commanded more artistic range in 5 minutes than most of her contracted performers showed in their entire careers. Marcus Webb stepped forward, his face pale. I've never seen anything like this. Ms. Sterling, we have to offer him the role." "Absolutely not," Victoria snapped, her composure finally shattering completely. "This is my theater, my production, my decision." The theater fell silent at her naked display of power over artistry. James Carter stood up slowly. "Victoria, you're finished. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for Sterling Entertainment tomorrow morning. Your behavior today is grounds for removal." "You can't do that," Victoria sputtered. "I own controlling interest." "Actually," Sarah Martinez interrupted with a cold smile, "you don't. I did some research last night. Your father's will stipulates that controlling interest transfers to the board if you're found guilty of discriminatory practices. Everything that happened here today is documented." Victoria's face went white as the legal implications hit her. Her empire, built on systemic exclusion and casual cruelty, was collapsing in real time. Anthony descended from the stage, his performance complete. The crowd parted before him like recognition of royalty. Casting directors pressed business cards into his hands. Fellow performers embraced him. Students asked for selfies with a future star. "Mr. Davis," Professor Rodriguez called out, "Juilliard would be honored to have you as a guest artist next semester." Dr. Williams added, "The Manhattan School would love to discuss a teaching position." But the most important voice came from the back of the theater. "Anthony Davis," Sarah Martinez announced formally, "I officially offer you the title role in our Broadway revival of The Phantom of the Opera, opening this fall at the Majestic Theater." The theater exploded in celebration. Anthony stood in the center of it all, no longer invisible, no longer diminished. 8 months of humiliation had been erased by 8 minutes of truth. Victoria Sterling sat alone in her seat, watching her world burn around her. She'd built her power on keeping talented people in their assigned places. Now she was learning the cost of underestimating someone's worth. Anthony approached her seat, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the suddenly hushed theater. "Ms. Sterling," he said with dignity that made her cruelty look even more pathetic, "you asked me to prove myself." "I believe I have. Now it's your turn to honor your word about acknowledging your mistake." Victoria looked up at him, seeing for the first time not a servant, but the artist he'd always been. The cameras were still rolling. The world was still watching. Her empire was crumbling, but she still had one choice left: own her cruelty or compound it with cowardice. The theater held its breath, waiting for her answer. Victoria Sterling sat in stunned silence for 30 seconds that felt like hours. Every camera in the theater was trained on her face, documenting the moment when decades of privilege and prejudice finally met their reckoning. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I was wrong." The admission hung in the air like a fragile thing, barely audible over the theater's collective-held breath. "I said I was wrong." Victoria's voice cracked as she stood, tears streaming down her face. "I judged Anthony based on his uniform, not his talent. I let my assumptions blind me to his worth. I humiliated a brilliant artist because I couldn't see past my own prejudice." The theater remained silent, processing the moment when absolute power met absolute accountability. "Anthony Davis," Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger. "You are extraordinarily talented. I apologize publicly for my treatment of you, and I resign from Sterling Entertainment effective immediately." The crowd erupted. Phones captured every moment of the most public apology in Broadway history. Victoria Sterling, who had controlled stages and careers for decades, was stepping down in disgrace. James Carter stood and began a slow clap. "That took courage, Victoria. Real courage." But the immediate aftermath was only the beginning. Within hours, the video had exploded across every platform. #AnthonyDavisVoice trending worldwide with over 50 million views. Major news networks picked up the story. The Today Show booked Anthony for an interview. Rolling Stone called for a feature. Sarah Martinez wasted no time. "Anthony, we're moving your opening night up. The buzz around this story is incredible. Broadway hasn't seen excitement like this in years. More offers poured in. The Metropolitan Opera requested a guest performance. Netflix approached me about a documentary. Record labels called with contract offers. But the most meaningful call came that evening." "Anthony," his mother's voice was thick with tears. "Your father saw the video. He spoke your name. First word since the stroke." Anthony sat in his Queens apartment, surrounded by business cards and contracts, but all that mattered was his father's voice saying his name again. The systemic changes came quickly. James Carter announced the Sterling Entertainment Equity Initiative, funding scholarships for underrepresented artists. The Broadway League implemented bias training requirements. Casting directors pledged transparent audition processes. Dr. Williams called with news that the Manhattan School was creating the Anthony Davis Fellowship for students from underprivileged backgrounds. Juilliard announced a similar program. 3 months later, Anthony stood on the majestic theater stage during his opening night as the Phantom. The audience included his parents, his grandmother, his former Juilliard classmates, and surprisingly, Victoria Sterling herself. She approached him after the show, sober and humble. "Anthony," she said quietly, "I wanted you to know that I've been in therapy, working on my biases. I'm also funding a foundation for artists facing financial hardship. I can't undo the harm I caused, but I can try to prevent it from happening to others." Anthony studied her face, seeing genuine remorse. "Victoria, everyone deserves a chance to grow. Thank you for taking responsibility." 6 months after that night at the Plaza Hotel, Anthony received a letter that made him cry. It was from a young black singer in Detroit who'd seen his story and refused to give up on her dreams, despite facing similar discrimination. "You showed me that our voices matter," she wrote. "Thank you for not staying silent." Anthony framed the letter and hung it in his dressing room at the Majestic, where he was now starring in his second Broadway production. The boy who'd sung in subway tunnels had become a voice for everyone who'd been told they didn't belong. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when he received a call from his old catering company. They were booking an event, a Sterling Entertainment gala celebrating their new diversity initiatives. "Would you be interested in performing?" they asked. Anthony smiled, remembering the last time he'd worked a Sterling event. "Actually," he said, "I think I know exactly what to sing." The circle was complete. The waiter had become the star. The underestimated had become triumphant. And somewhere in the city, another young artist was practicing in subway tunnels, carrying dreams that could no longer be dismissed. 2 years later, Anthony Davis stood backstage at Lincoln Center, adjusting his bow tie before the annual Broadway Honors Ceremony. Tonight, he was receiving the Rising Star Award, but more importantly, performing with the same orchestra where his dreams had begun. Through the curtain, he could see his father in the front row fully recovered, beaming with pride. His mother sat beside him, tears flowing. His grandmother clutched her program like sacred text. The irony wasn't lost on him. Nessun dorma, the song that launched his career, would close tonight's ceremony with full orchestral backing. As Anthony walked onto stage, he remembered that terrified waiter with trembling hands. That man felt like a stranger now, though Anthony carried his pain as a reminder of the journey traveled. The spotlight hit him. Anthony opened his mouth and sang, his voice soaring over the orchestra, filling Lincoln Center with the same power that once silenced a charity gala. But now it carried something more: hope, vindication, and unshakable knowledge that talent overcomes any system designed to suppress it. All'alba vincerò, vincerò, vincerò. The final notes rang out like victory, and Anthony thought of young artists watching at home, seeing themselves in his success. Your voice matters. Your dreams are valid. Sometimes the impossible stage is just one brave moment away. If you were in Anthony's position that night, would you have taken Victoria's challenge? What song would you choose to prove your worth? Share below. Every voice deserves to be heard. Sharp viewers caught something at 3:47 when Anthony mentions Puccini watching Victoria's face. That micro-expression reveals the exact moment she realized her mistake. Subscribe if you believe talent has no color, dignity has no price, and dreams delayed are never dreams denied. Stories like Anthony's prove that sometimes one voice changes everything.
At Black Voices Uncut, we don't polish away the pain or water down the message. We tell it like it is because the truth deserves nothing less. If today's story spoke to you, click like, join the conversation in the comments, and subscribe so you'll be here for the next Uncut Voice.